Hi friends, host Eric here, host of Talking with Famous People. I'm here in the room with assorted personages, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. It's an outline I made. I want to talk about this stuff. First of all, discursive environments. When people come in here, they talk about all kinds of random stuff, and a lot of times we'll talk about God or religion and stuff like that. So it's important to note that in general there are two qualities of discursive environment, namely sacred discursive environments, which are discursive environments that say these kind of arguments are not acceptable, and if you make these arguments in this context, uh, we will assign according status to you. And this can be community sacred standards, like in Islam, you're not supposed to draw a picture of Muhammad with poop on his face, but I do it all the time. But anyway, that's common to the whole community. A given family, on the other hand, might practice Islam in a way that doesn't embrace those notions, and of course, then they have their own understanding of what constitutes a sacred environment. The biggest dispute in general between Western cultures and Western ideals and communitarian cultures and communitarian ideals is the individualist societies don't accept the dominion of sacred environments over discourse. So, unless it's consensual, unless you've chosen to enter that environment. All right, the secular discursive environments are interpersonal. That's like if I'm just talking to Kim about whatever. Community, which are if I'm trying to have my speech publicly known and influence people in the community. A family discursive environment that it has its own rules, like don't talk like that to dad or whatever. Empirical discursive environments, which are things only count if they are methodologically sound, so you've got to, if you want to say ants always travel to the north, you've got to set up a test and try to make them go south. Anyway, a classroom environment is one in which one party is supposed to have the knowledge and the other party is supposed to accept their authority over a given topic. And the last environment is something like TwFP, where it's intended to be a discursive parsing environment that maintains an ecosystem-wide check on rule breaking, basically, like argumentational rule breaking. So it's important to note that whenever people are having a conversation, which may or may not turn into an argument, which may or may not cause a dispute, they do so in some sort of environment, a discursive environment. And one of the key points I want to make in this video is that people come in and talk about ideas that are very controversial or generally considered unacceptable, things that are deemed racist or anti-Semitic or whatever. They are welcome to come here and say those things, and they will not be condemned for being racist or anti-Semitic. And the reason is because this discursive environment understands that you might make any argument for the sake of argumentation, no matter how appalling it is, and it doesn't reflect anything upon you. I might say, let's say for the sake of argumentation, that we lived in a society where only bestiality was considered moral sex, and every time somebody got pregnant, then they were condemned because it meant they had sex with another human being. And let's say this was a good thing. Now, I'm not actually saying we should have a society where blah, 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 blah. I am saying, let's say for the point of argumentation, these things. I afford everybody that courtesy, even if they don't say, let's just say for the sake of argumentation, I assume the claims they make are for the sake of argumentation, and I don't expect to hold them to those claims after the dispute is over, after the disputed claim is over. And when we have an argument, or we're arguing about shit, it's because some claim is in dispute. Okay, the second thing we need to know before we're talking about talking in general is establishment on the flow. The flow means if we're having an argument about something, that the things you say get noted and written down, not actually written down probably, but remembered. And you're supposed to, if you say early in an argument, my point is that trees are green because of chlorophyll, and then later you make the argument that my point is that trees are green only because we want them to be green. and then I point out those things are in contradiction to each other, you don't, it's possible to kick one of them, but you need to say that. You say, okay, then I no longer make the claim that it's because they're filled with chlorophyll. I now make a different claim. I've changed my claim. It's okay for me to do so because it's not the thing we're arguing about. It's an argument that I'm using to make the point to defend the side that I am arguing about. So it's fine if I can kick claims, I can drop claims, that is to say, not extend them in the argument. I can extend claims, that is to say, continue to argue the same basic reason for things, the warrant for things, and expand upon it, provide further information about why it's effective. Uh, these are things I can do. So when we establish things on the flow, what that means is we make a claim, it gets put down on the flow, it gets noted, or we respond to a claim, we negate a claim. Maybe we link two established objects on the flow to each other and do some sort of logical work on it to create a third object. Well, regardless, that which gets said constrains each of the speakers. So if I make the argument that we should judge this dispute purely on the grounds of what's going to be the most monetarily profitable, well, then I've eliminated from relevance any arguments about what's going to be most fun, except insofar as I can prove a link between fun and monetary benefit. So when we say things, then, that means we don't get to say other things that contradict those things for the duration of this argument. And if we do, then both the contradictory things should be ignored entirely by both parties until the contradiction is resolved, either by kicking one of the arguments or by explaining why the apparent contradiction is not actually contradictory. Okay, so field knowledge then is part of the flow. Field knowledge is what we all agree is true without any dispute at all. So if I say, you know how there's enough oxygen on Earth for humans to successfully breathe and live in most places? And you go, yeah. Well, generally speaking, I don't need to prove something like that. That's called field knowledge, or just it comprises the field upon which you argue. Because we're having an argument, it means we're talking to each other, which means we understand words to mean basically the same thing, and we operate in a world where we assume basically the same sorts of things as a prerequisite to having a conversation. Even we assume that you're not going to turn into a lion in the middle of a conversation and eat me. I don't have to be wary of that. For example, that would be field level knowledge, just knowledge, not things we're discussing. Okay, another way that things can be established on the flow, though, so that's not really established on the flow, but you might say at some point, because everybody on Earth who's alive, every person on Earth who's alive breathes, I might say because of this, here's the conclusion. I don't have to prove the first part because it's field knowledge. The second way to get things established on the flow is agreement. If I say, okay, I'm claiming that when we use military force in the Middle East, it causes blowback. You go, okay, I agree with that. That's concession. If you simply don't respond to it when it's your turn to respond, then you've engaged in silence. Silence equals assent, which means I'm proposing this for the sake of argumentation. If you have no response to it, then I have no choice but to assume you agree with it, and let's move forward to the next step of the argumentation. If you don't respond to something at all, then the argument can't move forward unless there's a default position regarding that, which is, namely, silence equals assent. The third way you might establish something on the flow is through validity. That is to say, you draw a link between two different arguments and say, because of X, you said here that if we subsidize farms, then farms will produce more food. You said here that if we produce more food, that it will cause population explosion in Madagascar. And you said here that population explosion in Madagascar is a threat to endangered species, which are the most important problem the world faces today. So you just said we should take a course of action that makes the most important problem in the world today, logically. That's a way to establish a new conclusion or claim just using uh, the logic of a naturally occurring logic between objects already on the flow. All right, so what kind of objects go on the flow? It's not just claims and warrants, reasons why a claim is true. And a claim claims an impact normally. There's not impacts, not just impacts, not just warrants, not just reasons and impacts. There's also ground level arguments, which are comprised of reasons and have impacts on how the argument resolves out, but not within the argument. So a ground argument includes definitions. Well, that doesn't count as a dog for this argument. Wolves don't count as dogs for this argument. So your point about wolves is irrelevant in this argument about dogs. There are additionally resolutional metrics that says, okay, how are we going to resolve this? If it's just two people arguing, we're going to ideally reach agreement, or one person is going to defeat the other and get them to admit that they're wrong or whatever. If we're involving a disinterested party, then presumably we're leaving the matter of dispute up into the hands of the disinterested parties, who presumably can make a more reliable decision regarding which party made the best arguments, because they're not attached to it. They don't have a preference in terms of the position that wins, nor in terms of the people we're arguing. Okay, so resolutional metrics then are different for interested parties and disinterested. If disinterested parties are involved, then one ought to make arguments about the judging criterion. In other words, how should, at the end of this argument, you disinterested parties decide who's right? And I'm saying you should decide it by whoever does this, and you're saying we should decide by whoever does this first. Okay, so that's what generally comprises framework. Observations are things like field knowledge. Definitions are constraints of what's topical or allowed to count. And resolutional metrics are arguments about how we will finally determine the matter and determine a winner, given the fact that there's a lot of gray in terms of the definitional space. We need to inform not merely about the constraints of the definitions, but the attentional priorities of within the dispute. Like, if you win 10 different arguments, each of which gets you an impact of 1 penny positive, and I win one argument which says if we vote for you, we get global nuclear war, it doesn't matter how much work you did in those 10 arguments, you're not going to win the round because your impacts are so minor compared to the massive impacts of the person who successfully established nuclear war. As a consequence, a resolutional metric may be necessary in some circumstances. We shouldn't consider hypothetical link stories attributing an outcome of nuclear war to my proposed action, which has nothing to do with radioactive materials, war, or weapons. Would be a way to remind the listener that outrageous claims, no matter how massive the impacts, have very low probability and thus not dictate our decision making. Okay, the last area I want to go over in this one here is God. People argue about God all the time. Existence and instantiation. What does that mean? For something to exist, there must be at least one instance of it. So, to say that you create an instance of something means I'm creating an instance of a YouTube video right now. This YouTube video now exists because it's been instantiated. Now, there's physical existence and instantiation. A physical object that's existent is spatially distinct. It's an instance of itself, and potentially an instance of some set as well, but it's not really relevant. It's subject to the law of non-contradiction. Because I'm sitting here in this chair talking on this mic, I'm not concurrently, at the same time, also at Denny's. not possible because I'm subject to the law of non-contradiction. I'm a spatially distinct object. I can't be in two places at once, and there's only one of me. I'm time linear, my body is, which means it proceeds through time. I get older, never younger. And I persist through time unchanged unless acted upon. Now, it's true that because I'm a living body, a living physical object, and I have a metaphysical component, that means that I change through a process called growth, and I have a lifespan. But if I'm a physical object that's not a living creature, then I persist through time apparently unchanged unless acted upon. For example, if you look at a rock, it's acted upon by wind and erosion, or people hitting it with a hammer or whatever, and it changes. If you put it in a perfect vacuum, it doesn't change. Even something like water, that's a liquid, we could put a single drop of water on a airtight, watertight little container on a little plastic plate or something, and observe it for many years, and it will never do anything. Just change and stay. It just stay exactly what it is. So, while it may not be spatially distinct in the sense that a glass of water, the glass might be spatially distinct, but the water is not spatially distinct insofar as it's entirely fungible. You can exchange any bit of water for any other bit of water and can't tell the difference. It's only spatially distinct on a droplet level, or maybe on an atomic level or something, but nevertheless it is spatially distinct. You can't have two water molecules in the same location, time, space, and context. Alright, metaphysical existence and instantiation is different. Metaphysical objects are spatially indistinct. That is to say, we can have multiple copies of it. We can each have a copy of that song in our head. We each can know Mary Had a Little Lamb, be able to sing in our head, for it to be existent insofar as we can observe it, and for it to be basically the same over every time we access it. But it's not subject to the law of non-contradiction because it exists in both of us concurrently as a metaphysical object. It's time fluid. That means if I know Mary Had a Little Lamb, I can sing it faster, I can sing it slower. I can, after it's done, I can re-experience it exactly the same again as though I was traveling back in time. Except I'm not. I'm just choosing to experience it again and forward. That's not true of physical stuff. If I ride a horse, I can't experience it again unless I go out and ride a horse again. Now, the last one is it persists only through the active attention of agents. A metaphysical object does not exist except insofar as it is known as an entity of sorts within the minds of individual agents. So it has no corporeal form and thus is not subject to the various laws of physical objects. The problem then, this is all I'm going to cover in this short video here. I'll ask for you guys' comments in a second, but I just want to draw the point here, is that the problem with making claims like God exists is that if you're saying God metaphysically exists, you're saying he's spatially distinct. If you're saying if he physically exists, you're saying he's spatially distinct stuff. But if he also metaphysically exists, then he's a single living creature, because that's the definition of a single living creature: is that which exists concurrently as both a physical object and a metaphysical agent. If you exist only metaphysically, then you have no distinct spatial identity, in the same way that we can each have a copy of an MP3 of a song and they be indistinguishable from one another, and occupy no real space meaningfully. So if we're going to say God exists only metaphysically, then we're saying he's a digital file. If we're going to say God exists only physically, then we're going to say he's a rock or something. And if we're going to say he exists both metaphysically and physically, then we've just defined him as a living creature, a single entity living creature who's subject to the law of non-contradiction in his body and time linear, and thus, presumably Not omnipotent, I guess. I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but the point is, people talk about existence and don't distinguish between the different ways in which things exist. They exist conceptually, they exist metaphysically as entities or as aphorisms or sentences or whatever. They exist physically as actual objects like this lighter that would appear to persist even when no one's observing it. That's what we were talking about earlier. I mean, I'm of the mindset that it does persist when I'm not observing it, but that requires God. From my perspective, as a proof of God's existence, I prefer the grand observer proof. Does it prove anything? Well, first of all, it doesn't prove God. It proves the grand observer. That's not the same thing as God. If I have a system that is small enough in both size and complexity from my scale and perspective, then I'd be able to watch the whole thing without any problem. It may be inconceivable to us that our entire known universe could be of such a scale that it is both small enough and not complex enough that it could be observed all at once by a single being. That being would obviously have to be orders of magnitude greater in scale than our universe, but nevertheless would not necessarily have to be omnipotent, nor God, as we wouldn't know how that entity functions within his own mega scale universe. Okay, thoughts, anyone? Okay, that's part one of this. Next time I make a video, I'll do part two, and the part two is words, proofs overview, specific proofs, subjectivism, and objectivism. So I go over some of the popular God proofs, or I will. I mean, I don't go over it. It's not like I've written it out or something. I just outline it.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah, I just do some of them. I mean, most of them are one of several categories of proof. But yeah, they're the big ones.
Ontological, teleological, ontological.
Teleological.
Yeah,
that's a weak ass proof, though. Teleological proof is weak.
I don't know. I mean, it goes down to the the idea that any sort of minor change in, for instance, like the gravitational pull, or and like the I don't know what you call it, the nuclear force, like between parts of the atom to hold it together and stuff like that. Like if those were minutely changed, then the universe couldn't exist the way it does. It would either collapse into infinitely dense mass, or it would expand into being equidistant atoms from one another. And then even if not that, even if it was even more minutely changed, like we wouldn't have complex life like humans. Like that wouldn't be able to exist. Like, so you could say that, well, you could have an infinite number of universes or whatever, and we just happen to be in the one where it's like this.
I mean, I would say, obviously, our presence here supervenes upon a reality that allows us to exist.
Yeah, and then this reality existing, basically the idea is it would be very unlikely.
Okay, but
if it was random.
The problem with the teleological proof in general is all it says is if things were different, they wouldn't be the same. Congratulations, you're right.
But it's just minutely different. It's not even just a little. It's not even like a big change or anything like that. Like everything is in alignment with one another. That the universe is somewhat stable.
I mean, but think about it. It's called a ex post facto fallacy. Think about it like this.
I mean, I don't think it's the best one either. I'm just describing what it is.
All right, but everything has to align perfectly for me to meet Kim and get with her. It must be the slabs. I agree it's the slabs, but it's not a proof of anything. It's just there's a certain amount of serendipity that happens that you just personally, subjectively come to embrace the notion that um, you can. I came to embrace the notion of destiny. Basically that's the notion I embrace is destiny. That I am purposed.
Uh-huh.
But I can't exactly claim that the various serendipitous experiences that comprise enough anecdotal evidence to convince me, I'll convince anybody else. Know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I don't know if those two things are equivalent, though.
I don't know either.
Like one is dependent upon like a like physical, I guess you could call them metaphysical if you want, but laws of the universe, and then the other one has to deal with the actions you chose or something like that. I mean, that's different.
Explain again? I'm not sure. I'm sure you're right, but I'm a little slow in the brain.
I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking aloud. I don't even know if I agree with myself. Okay. I'm just saying that like one is dealing with physical laws and of the universe, and the other one is dealing with decisions that you make in your personal life.
What are the two things though that are the reference to that?
So like an example, you can look up William Lane Craig on the internet. I forgot exactly. Like he's one that he wrote a book and he basically goes over a whole bunch of arguments for God's existence, and he goes over like a teleological argument. I'll look it up real quick.
Okay, well, thanks for watching Time with People. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese. That's part one. Now has Mark's looking up some stuff.
Oh, I didn't know that was a video. Okay, my bad.
It makes me want to do part two now because I go into reference and stuff like that, but I'm not going to do it right now probably. But anyway, thanks for watching.